It was the week before Christmas, 1972. In Hanoi, people were doing what people do in the days before a holiday. Markets were open. Children were in schools. The city had lived with the Vietnam War for so long that a certain grim normalcy had settled over it. The kind of normalcy that comes not from safety, but from the simple human inability to sustain maximum terror indefinitely. There had been bombing before. There had been pauses. There had been negotiations. There had been more bombing. The rhythm of it had become, in its horrible way, familiar. Then, on the night of December 18th, the radar operators saw something they had never seen before. Not one aircraft, not a squadron, not even a large raid. A wall, a moving wall of aircraft, stretching across the radar screens from horizon to horizon. 129 B-52 Stratofortresses, the largest, heaviest, most destructive strategic bombers ever built, were coming in 3 waves, each wave separated by just enough time to ensure that the moment one nightmare ended, another was already beginning. The sky over Hanoi went black. What followed over the next 11 days would be called by its critics the most savage aerial bombardment of a civilian capital since World War II. It would be called by its architects the military action that finally broke a diplomatic deadlock that had cost 58,000 American lives and more than 2 million Vietnamese lives over nearly 2 decades. It would be condemned by the Pope, denounced by the United States Senate, and celebrated, privately, quietly, by the American negotiators who watched North Vietnam return to the peace table within 2 weeks of its conclusion. It was Operation Linebacker II, and the argument about what it actually achieved has never fully ended. To understand why those bombers were in the air on December 18, 1972, you have to go back to Paris, to a negotiating table where 2 sides had been talking and lying and stalling and talking again for 4 years. The Paris Peace Accords negotiations had begun in 1968, in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, the massive North Vietnamese and Viet Cong assault that had failed militarily but succeeded catastrophically in destroying American public confidence in the war. President Lyndon Johnson had halted the bombing of North Vietnam and sent negotiators to Paris, hoping that diplomacy could extract the United States from a conflict that had already consumed his presidency and was tearing his country apart. The talks went nowhere for 4 years. North Vietnam stalled with the patience of a side that believed time was working in its favor. The United States negotiated with the desperation of a side that needed to leave but couldn't leave empty-handed. The fighting continued throughout the negotiations, hundreds of Americans and thousands of Vietnamese dying every month. While diplomats argued about the shape of the conference table, Richard Nixon had been elected in 1968, partly on the promise of ending the war. His national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had been conducting secret back-channel negotiations with North Vietnamese representative Lê Đức Thọ in Paris for years. By October 1972, they believed they had finally reached an agreement, a framework that would allow American forces to withdraw, return American prisoners of war, and leave the political future of South Vietnam to be determined later. Through some vague process that both sides interpreted differently and neither side fully intended to honor. Kissinger, in one of the most premature announcements in diplomatic history, told reporters on October 26, 1972, "Peace is at hand." South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu refused to accept the terms. He had not been adequately consulted during the negotiations, and he understood, correctly, that the agreement essentially abandoned South Vietnam to eventual North Vietnamese domination. He demanded 69 changes to the draft agreement. North Vietnam, watching the Americans and South Vietnamese argue with each other, decided the moment was opportune for a different kind of stalling. Their negotiators returned to Paris and began raising new objections, walking back concessions they had already made, and generally behaving like a side that had concluded the Americans were too divided, and too desperate to hold firm. By December 1972, the talks had completely collapsed. Kissinger and Lê Đức Thọ were not speaking. The October framework was in tatters. American prisoners remained in North Vietnamese camps. American troops were still dying. The war that was supposed to be ending was, diplomatically speaking, exactly where it had been 4 years earlier. Nixon faced a choice. He could continue the fruitless negotiations indefinitely, accepting the humiliation of a stalemate while his domestic political position eroded further. Or he could try something drastic, something that would either break the deadlock or break the United States' remaining credibility in Southeast Asia entirely. He chose drastic. The B-52 Stratofortress was not designed for the kind of war being fought in Vietnam. It was designed for nuclear apocalypse, a Cold War instrument built to carry hydrogen bombs deep into Soviet territory in the event of World War III. It was enormous, loud, slow by fighter standards, and almost comically vulnerable to modern surface-to-air missiles if used incorrectly. The Air Force had been using it in Vietnam since 1965, primarily for carpet bombing missions over South Vietnam and Laos, flying at altitudes too high for the enemy to see or hear until the bombs were already falling. But Nixon and his military commanders had largely avoided using B-52s against Hanoi and Haiphong, North Vietnam's capital and its main port city. The reasons were partly political. Bombing a capital city with strategic bombers risked international condemnation, Chinese or Soviet intervention, and domestic outrage. They were partly tactical. Hanoi was surrounded by one of the most sophisticated air defense systems ever assembled outside the Soviet Union itself, supplied and largely operated by Soviet advisors. Surface-to-air missile batteries ringed the city. MiG fighter interceptors were ready. The radar networks were dense and overlapping. Previous bombing campaigns against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder from 1965 to 1968, and the earlier phase of Linebacker in 1972, had used primarily tactical aircraft, F-105s, F-4 Phantoms, A-6 Intruders. These were faster and more maneuverable than B-52s, better suited to evading missiles and hitting specific targets. But they carried smaller bomb loads. They could damage North Vietnam's military infrastructure. They could not, Nixon and his generals believed, deliver the kind of shock, the kind of overwhelming, sustained, inescapable demonstration of destructive power that might actually change North Vietnam's political calculations. For that, you needed the B-52. On December 14, 1972, Nixon gave the order Operation Linebacker II would commence. On December 18th, the B-52s would fly every night, for as long as it took, against Hanoi's airfields, rail yards, power plants, radio stations, port facilities, storage depots, and air defense infrastructure. The objective was not to destroy North Vietnam. It was to destroy North Vietnam's ability to believe that time was on its side. General Alexander Haig delivered the message to Hanoi through diplomatic back channels before the bombing began. The United States would stop when North Vietnam returned to the negotiations in good faith. Not a day before. At 7:44 p.m. on December 18, 1972, the first bombs fell on Hanoi. The initial wave of 48 B-52s came in from the Gulf of Tonkin, flying in tight three-aircraft cells at altitudes between 30,000 and 35,000 feet. Below them, the North Vietnamese air defense system, 26 SAM battalions equipped with Soviet-supplied SA-2 guideline missiles, plus hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and a squadron of MiG interceptors, came to life with a ferocity that had been years in preparation. The SA-2 missiles rose in waves, enormous pillars of fire and smoke climbing from the darkness below, curving toward the bomber streams with eerie precision. The B-52 crews, many of whom had never flown against anything more threatening than light anti-aircraft fire, over the Laotian jungle suddenly found themselves in a sky filled with missiles. 3 B-52s were shot down on the first night. Their crews, those who survived the shoot-down, parachuted into North Vietnam and were immediately captured. Inside Hanoi, the effect was unlike anything the city had experienced. Previous bombing raids had been terrifying. This was something categorically different. The B-52 flew too high to see and too high to hear, until its bombs were already on their way down. There was no warning, no gradual build-up of sound, no time to run. Just a sudden earth-shaking detonation that seemed to come from everywhere at once. And then another, each stick of bombs walking across the target in a pattern that could cover an area the size of several city blocks. Hanoi's civil defense system, years in the making, tested in previous raids, activated immediately. Residents who had not evacuated to the countryside in previous months descended into the network of individual and communal bomb shelters that lined the streets. Every Hanoi resident had been assigned a specific shelter and drilled in reaching it quickly. The government had worked hard to ensure that the city's civilian population was as protected as possible, partly from genuine concern and partly because civilian casualties were a powerful propaganda weapon. The bombing would continue for 10 more nights. What followed was a military operation of extraordinary intensity and, in the context of the war's history, remarkably focused targeting. American planners had drawn up a target list that deliberately excluded the civilian residential areas of Hanoi's city center. The targets were military and infrastructure, the Gia Lam Railroad Yard, which handled supplies coming from China, the Hanoi Petroleum Storage Facility, the Kien No Vehicle Repair Complex, the Yen Vien Rail Yard, the Paul Domer Bridge, the great railway bridge over the Red River that had been bombed, repaired, and bombed again throughout the war, Tai Nguyen Thermal Power Plant, Bac Giang Thermal Power Plant, airfields, air defense radar installations, SAM storage sites. The intent was systematic destruction of North Vietnam's capacity to wage war and, crucially, its capacity to supply its forces in the south. Every rail line leading into Hanoi from China was targeted. Every significant fuel storage facility within range was hit. The goal was not to kill North Vietnamese civilians. The goal was to make North Vietnam's leadership understand viscerally and inescapably that the United States retained the capability and the will to reduce their military infrastructure to rubble faster than it could be repaired. But precision bombing in 1972 was not what precision bombing would become. Bombs missed. Some missed by small margins and hit neighboring residential areas. On December 26th, bombs intended for the Gia Lam Railroad Yard struck the Bach Mai Hospital, Hanoi's largest civilian medical facility, killing hospital staff and patients. The images of the destroyed hospital went around the world and produced an international outcry that the Nixon administration struggled to contain. The North Vietnamese claimed thousands of civilian dead. American assessments were far lower. The true figure, as with so many statistics from the Vietnam War, remains disputed. What is not disputed is that civilian deaths occurred, that they were far lower than in comparable strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, and that they were immediately and effectively used by North Vietnam's propaganda apparatus to portray the United States as a nation deliberately targeting civilians. The military cost to the United States was also significant. Over the 11 days of Linebacker II, 15 B-52s were shot down, a loss rate that alarmed Pentagon planners and Air Force commanders. 11 more were damaged. 33 American airmen were killed. 33 were captured. 26 were rescued. The loss of 15 B-52s represented roughly 2% of the total force committed to the operation. In absolute terms, it was a small percentage. In terms of the psychological impact on American crews, who had been trained to believe the B-52 was nearly invulnerable at altitude, it was significant. By the final nights of the campaign, some crews were refusing to fly. There were incidents of aircraft turning back before reaching their targets. On the North Vietnamese side, the air defense system, despite its remarkable performance in the early nights, was running out of missiles. The SA-2 stockpile that had taken years to accumulate was being consumed at a rate that Soviet resupply could not match in real time. By the final nights of the campaign, the number of SAMs fired per B-52 had dropped dramatically. The sky that had been lethal in the first wave was becoming survivable. While generals argued about aircraft losses and bomb damage assessments, the people of Hanoi were living through something that statistics cannot adequately describe. The city had been partially evacuated in previous years. Children, the elderly, and non-essential workers had been sent to the countryside during earlier bombing campaigns. But hundreds of thousands of people remained. Factory workers, government employees, military personnel, medical staff, and the simply immovable, the sick, the stubborn, the people who had nowhere else to go. They lived in the shelters. The individual shelters, cylindrical concrete tubes sunk into the sidewalks, each one barely large enough for a single adult, became the defining image of Hanoi under the Christmas bombing. At the sound of the air raid sirens, the city's population descended into these tubes and pulled the concrete lids over their heads. They sat in total darkness, listening to the world above them being destroyed, not knowing if the next explosion would be close enough to kill them. Between raids, life continued with an almost defiant normality that became its own form of resistance. Markets reopened in the hours between bombing waves. Government radio continued broadcasting. Schools relocated to the countryside kept operating. The North Vietnamese government understood that maintaining the appearance of normal life was itself a military and political act, evidence that the bombing was not breaking the population's will. But the private reality was different from the public face. Diaries and memoirs from Hanoi residents during this period described the particular psychological torment of waiting, the endless, exhausting uncertainty of not knowing when the next raid would come, whether tonight would be the night that the bombs finally found your shelter, your hospital, your neighborhood. Children who had been through previous bombing campaigns had developed a specific terror of the B-52 that was different from their fear of tactical aircraft. The tactical jets you could hear coming, the B-52, gave no warning. The night of December 26th was the heaviest of the entire campaign. Over 100 B-52s flew that night in a concentrated assault designed to overwhelm North Vietnam's diminishing air defenses. The city shook continuously for hours. Windows that had survived the earlier raids finally shattered. Structures weakened by previous strikes collapsed. The Bach Mai Hospital, already damaged, was hit again. By December 27th, something had shifted in Hanoi. Not in the streets, where the official face remained defiant, but in the government buildings where North Vietnam's leadership was making its calculations. The North Vietnamese leadership in December 1972 was not a monolith. It was a collective of experienced revolutionary fighters, political operatives, and military strategists who had been conducting their own careful analysis of the strategic situation throughout the bombing campaign. Their public position was absolute defiance. Radio Hanoi broadcast denunciations of American barbarism. Official statements promised that the Vietnamese people would never surrender to air power. The propaganda machine ran at full speed, and internationally it was remarkably effective, producing exactly the condemnation of American policy that Hanoi needed. But behind the defiant public face, the leadership was confronting a set of military and political realities that were genuinely alarming. The SAM stockpiles were depleted. Soviet resupply was coming, but not fast enough. The air defense system that had been North Vietnam's greatest military achievement. The network that had shot down over 900 American aircraft over the course of the war was running out of the missiles that made it lethal. Without those missiles, Hanoi was vulnerable to bombing on a scale that had not yet occurred. The rail lines from China, North Vietnam's primary supply route, were severed or severely damaged. The petroleum storage facilities were destroyed. The power grid was crippled. The infrastructure that supported North Vietnam's military operations in the south was being systematically dismantled faster than it could be repaired. And there was the international dimension. The Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam's principal patrons, were both, for different reasons, moving toward accommodation with the United States in 1972. Nixon's historic visit to China in February and his summit with Brezhnev in May had fundamentally altered the geopolitics of the war. North Vietnam could no longer count on its great power sponsors to pressure Washington on its behalf with the same urgency as in previous years. On December 26, the same night as the heaviest bombing, North Vietnam sent a signal through diplomatic back channels. It was willing to return to the negotiations. Nixon ordered a halt to the bombing north of the 20th parallel on December 29th. On January 8, 1973, Kissinger and Lê Đức Thọ met again in Paris. On January 27, 1973, 39 days after the first B-52s crossed the coast of North Vietnam, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The war for the United States was over. The debate over what Operation Linebacker II actually achieved began before the ink was dry on the Paris Accords, and has continued ever since. The case for the bombing's effectiveness rests on a sequence of events that is difficult to dismiss. North Vietnam had been stalling the negotiations for months. Kissinger's October framework had collapsed. 2 weeks of intensive B-52 strikes later, North Vietnam was back at the table, and within a month, the agreement was signed. The correlation is stark. Proponents argue that the bombing accomplished precisely what Nixon intended. It demonstrated to Hanoi that the United States retained both the capability and the political will to impose unacceptable costs, and that continuing to stall would lead not to an American withdrawal on North Vietnamese terms, but to the progressive destruction of North Vietnam's military infrastructure. General John Vogt, commander of the 7th Air Force, argued that Linebacker II broke the back of North Vietnam's air defense system and left Hanoi militarily vulnerable in a way it had never been before. The case against is equally serious. Critics, including many who were involved in the negotiations, argue that the Paris Accords signed in January 1973 were not substantially different from the October 1972 framework that Hanoi had already accepted and that had collapsed due to South Vietnamese objections, not North Vietnamese ones. If Hanoi agreed to essentially the same terms in January that it had accepted in October, the argument goes the bombing did not change what North Vietnam was willing to sign. It merely provided Nixon with the domestic political cover he needed to pressure Thieu into accepting an agreement that South Vietnam had rejected 3 months earlier. There is also the longer view. The Paris Accords did not end the war in Vietnam. They ended American involvement in it. North Vietnamese forces remained in South Vietnam throughout the period following the Accords. The political future of South Vietnam, left deliberately vague in the agreement, was resolved in April 1975 when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon and the South Vietnamese government collapsed. The outcome that Nguyen Van Thieu had feared in October 1972 occurred anyway, 2.5 years later. From that perspective, Operation Linebacker II brought South Vietnam not survival, but a 2-year delay, and brought the United States not victory, but an exit. In the accounting of Operation Linebacker II, it is easy to lose the individual human beings inside the statistics. The B-52 crews who flew over Hanoi in December 1972 were professional airmen, officers and enlisted men who had volunteered for military service, trained for years, and now found themselves doing something their aircraft and their training had not fully prepared them for. The B-52 had been designed for a nuclear war that everyone hoped would never happen. Its crews had trained to fly one-way missions into Soviet airspace, missions from which return was not guaranteed. But they had also understood, at some level, that the nuclear scenario was a deterrent, a threat, a contingency. The reality of flying through a wall of surface-to-air missiles over an actual city was different from anything that training had conveyed. The men who were shot down and captured joined the existing population of American prisoners of war in the North Vietnamese prison system, a system that had become, by 1972, one of the most politically charged issues in the entire war. The prisoners, many of whom had been held for years, some since the mid-1960s, were a constant reminder of the human cost of the diplomatic stalemate. Their return was a Central American demand in the Paris negotiations, and their families' anguish was a constant pressure on the Nixon administration to produce an agreement. When the Paris Accords were signed, the release of American prisoners was one of the first provisions implemented. In February and March 1973, 591 American prisoners of war returned home in Operation Homecoming, among them men who had spent 8 years in captivity, men who had been tortured, men who had not seen their children grow up. For these men, whatever one thought of the bombing that preceded their release, the signing of the Paris Accords was not an abstraction. It was the end of something that had seemed, on some of the darker nights in the Hanoi Hilton, like it might never end. On January 27, 1973, in a conference room in Paris, representatives of the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed an agreement that was supposed to end the longest war in American history. The document was 23 pages long. It called for a ceasefire, an American withdrawal, the return of prisoners, and the eventual peaceful reunification of Vietnam through democratic means. It was, by the standards of the diplomatic achievement it represented, a remarkable piece of paper. It lasted, in practical terms, about 2 years. Operation Linebacker II remains one of the most contested military operations in American history. Contested not in terms of what happened, which is reasonably well documented, but in terms of what it meant. Did 11 days of B-52 strikes force North Vietnam to make peace? Or did they simply accelerate the conclusion of an agreement that was going to happen anyway, at the cost of civilian lives, international condemnation, and 15 aircraft with their crews? The answer depends, in the end, on what you think the Vietnam War was about, what you think American strategy in Southeast Asia was trying to achieve, and whether you believe that the 2-year extension of South Vietnamese independence that the Paris Accords provided was a meaningful outcome or a cruel postponement. What is not debatable is what the 11 days cost. In Hanoi, the Bach Mai Hospital had to be rebuilt. Neighborhoods around the targeted rail yards and power plants had to be reconstructed. Families who lost people in the bombing had to find a way to live with that loss. In America, 33 more airmen were dead. 33 more were in prisoner of war camps, waiting for the agreement that would bring them home. And in the Paris conference room, on the morning of January 27th, 1973, Henry Kissinger and Lê Đức Thọ sat across from each other and signed their names to a document that both of them knew was not the end of anything, but that both of them, for different reasons, needed the world to believe was peace.